From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I am Ken Davis, and as always, we're very glad that you're with us today. So, are you a Trump supporter? Did you vote for Donald Trump? Are you getting any kind of feelings of regret, any little twinges of regret right now? Well, maybe you aren't. However, we here in Chicago, basically for the most part, didn't vote for Donald Trump. So what we have to look at today is, what does this mean for those of us who live in, love, and work in Chicago? And it's a kind of a tough question. But I thought maybe what we should do is, just for those of you who missed the last, 15 minutes of the Trump administration, we should just do a quick box score here, okay? We have Jeff Sessions at Justice. He's anti-immigrant. He's been accused of racism. He likes Muslim bans, the kind of guy you would like to be your chief law guy in the country. We have at the United Nations, Nikki Haley. She has absolutely no foreign affairs experience whatsoever, but she'll learn on the job. For Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, I believe his name is pronounced, and he has foreclosed on 36,000 homes when he bought one little company out in California. That's the kind of guy we need running Treasury. How about Tom Price over at Health and Human Services? Well, now there's the guy you want to have, because he has been an avowed opponent of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. He's been one of the people leading the fight against it, so you know where that's going. Oh, one of my favorites is education. Betsy DeVos. She, among many things, she is somebody who really kind of knows what we need to have in the Department of Education, and that is more charter schools and vouchers, because the good thing about vouchers is it sucks money out of those evil public schools and allows you to put them into parochial and religious and private schools. Maybe you don't agree with that. I don't know. My favorite yesterday, of course, is Scott Pruitt over at the EPA. He is a spokesman and a legal assistant to the extraction industries in America, and he's going to get to run the EPA. So that's kind of the background, but we didn't mention one, did we? Dr. Ben Carson over at HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And he will have, I would assume, a pretty great effect on the city of Chicago. But we don't know that, so that's why we called in the experts. I'm really happy to have two of my favorite Chicago observers sitting at the table with us right now today. Lee Bay is back. Hi, Lee. How you doing?
Good to see you. Doing well.
Lee worked for Mayor Daley for a number of years. You were an architecture critic for the Sun-Times. You've worked in media. You've worked in the private sector. You've worked in the public sector. And you've written extensively about Chicago, and you're a great Facebook guy.
Thank you.
So I think you're qualified to discuss this with us. And, look who's back, Ethan Michaeli. He didn't even have handlers or anything when he came in this morning.
Look at that.
The acclaimed author of the acclaimed book, The Defender, which, as I said when you were here almost a year ago, is a brilliant book, and I am just so pleased to have you back again. The book's doing rather well, I see.
Thank you. Yeah, it's doing great.
Well, let me say what I said to you before, which is that by chronicling a storied African-American newspaper at the zenith of its influence in Chicago at the turn of the last century, you actually were writing a history of a newspaper and the people who created it, but you were also writing this very important sort of alternative history of the city of Chicago. And by doing that, you're also writing a history of the United States, which of course has been recognized by the New York Times and God knows how many other people who've put you on their lists of great books. So I just need to say that. I'm proud to know you, and I think you've done a phenomenal job. So,
well, thank you very much. The book is it was a story that needed to be told.
Yes.
And both of you guys have known me for a lot of years and knew that I would have been very happy to have told the story well, and for the two of you and a few others to have read it and appreciated it.
I know that's true, and I also know how long you worked on it and how difficult a job it was to produce, because it is such an exhaustive thing. And I just
Yeah.
remember you've been on the show many, many times, and afterward we would talk and say, so how's it going? And you'd say, well, it's coming along.
Yeah, yeah. Nobody believed me that I was going to actually finish it. And, you know, it's clocked in at over 500 pages. So
Well,
yeah.
anyway, Lee, let's start with you.
All right.
Dr. Ben Carson, I got to say one thing for Dr. Ben Carson. He's more self-aware than all the other people I mentioned because he says, I have no qualifications to do this job, and I don't want to do this job. You know, I'm a surgeon, a retired surgeon. I've never run anything, and so, you know, so at least he has that going for him, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I have a question. I'm not sure if I do or not. Let me shoot this at you, okay? The Chicago Housing Authority is in a massive transformation. It's planned for transformation. It's torn down hundreds of thousands of units. It's replaced some, but not nearly enough of them. It's gone through, what, 6 directors in the last decade or so? I mean, it's, you know, it's been filled with scandals about how it handles its money and everything else. Put that in perspective with a guy coming in to office as the head of HUD. What does that mean?
Well, it means 2 things. One of 2 things. One is that all the bad stuff that you described, those were the good old days compared to where we're going to go in the next 4 years.
That's it. I'm out of here. I can't do this show.
That's it. We'll look back on the times fondly when the city couldn't build enough public housing and wouldn't. We'd say, "Oh, we get misty-eyed. I miss those days." But it means 2. It means one of 2 things. This is the most puzzling of picks to me because with Ben Carson, you have a guy who seems to be a bit anti-city. He certainly is anti-poverty. He says in his book that that poverty is a condition of choice. That people choose to be poor.
Could I read the quote to you?
Please do.
This is from his very mouth. Having grown up in dire poor, the thing that I hated the most in life was poverty. I just hated poverty. But as I began to read those books, particularly about people's accomplishments, I began to realize that poverty was really more of a choice than anything else, and that I could change that. And it just really depended on how hard I wanted to work.
I'm sure for people who are poor that's news to them.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that they've chosen this life.
Just
for
coming home from your third job at $8 an hour, if you could only work a little harder.
That's right, and not choose to be poor. So there's that. This pick is puzzling to me, obviously, as I said, but it's interesting because if we get as HUD directors, if we get Ben Carson, the healer. Right? Mm-hmm. Then it can be interesting because, when it comes to healing the body and making sure that everything's together, that quality housing and access to safe neighborhoods, safe, affordable, and walkable neighborhoods is part of health. Mm-hmm. If he sees it that way, it could be interesting because cities obviously play a big role in that. He could inform where mass transit goes. I mean, he could really be a first among equals in that cabinet if he chooses to go that way. My hunch is that he won't. That he's an ideologue, and what he'll do is that he'll repeat right-wing talking points. Poverty is a choice. That HUD, in terms of forcing and requiring housing to be built in places that are not already poor, just only in poor areas, but also in wealthier areas too. There's social engineering, which he wrote in the Washington Times about a year ago. I think that's the guy who's going to show up for work on day one, and that's the guy I find distressing and troubling.
And I think when that happens, and I think you're exactly right, he's going to run right into the debate that he is least qualified to handle, which is the debate inside the Republican Party. Let's back up for a second and look at what HUD actually does. HUD, the public housing portfolio, the public housing part of the HUD portfolio is a tiny part of what it does, less than 15% if I'm not wrong. What HUD really does today are 2 things. It handles community development block grants, which go to hellholes like Bucktown and Riverdale, as well as our friend Chris Roebling's hometown and other places around the country. They're distributed to do things like, radical things like build sidewalks and plant trees and this kind of stuff. the other thing that HUD does
It's a
is
$50 billion agency.
yeah, and the other thing that HUD does is manage housing choice vouchers around the country.
Right.
Now, this is where the Republican debate really gets hot, because there have been efforts to cut housing choice vouchers, to set time limits on housing choice vouchers. They run into Republican opposition. Why? Because like with other types of welfare benefits, if that's what we want to call them, housing choice vouchers go overwhelmingly to low-income white people in red states. They go to white people in red counties in Wisconsin. They go to other people all over the country who
Those welfare queens out there.
exactly.
Rural Wisconsin, yeah.
So in Chicago, you now have an experiment from the CHA to, and let's look at the CHA for a second. The biggest scandal with the CHA in the last few years has not just been that they've failed to build the mixed income communities that they promised, which were replacement housing for the high rises that they demolished, but also that the CHA has $400 million and maybe more sitting in the bank that they can't figure out how to spend. At a time that there are homeless on the streets, that there's a dire need for housing, they cannot figure out how to spend the money. This is the complicated situation that Ben Carson is going to come into. I personally don't think that he's either politically or experientially, and perhaps not intellectually, calibrated for this particular task. This is really one that he's going to have to navigate. And I think what will happen is, as may happen, frankly, this may be a metaphor for what goes on in the Trump administration generally, is that the bureaucrats will take over. Yeah. The bureaucrats will negotiate with Congress, and that will be really what's going on. Ben Carson will come in, sign papers, make speeches, but I'm not sure that he really will be in charge of HUD, or that we'll know what's going on.
You know,
I'm sorry, I thought I was cutting you off there.
No, not at all, not at all. You know, I hope that's what happens. Isn't it funny? We're hoping the bureaucrats take over, right? I mean, that's, that would be the, but this happens at a time when, cities are rebounding, across the nation. Our city, unfortunately, is losing population, but other cities are not and are gaining population. And what a great time to have a visionary in this role that can really take all those resources, enforce fair housing laws. They do that. HUD does that too, but properly enforce them. What a time it could be of renaissance for these cities if we have the right guy in. And I'm doubting that we do.
I think that is such an important point that you just raised about enforcement of fair housing laws, because this is one of the
very law that Trump's father and he violated in the 70s.
Right.
These are the 73. Right. These are the laws that he has to enforce now.
Right.
It just boggles the mind.
Right.
It's like the whole list that you read. It's like Fox is putting on the chicken suit and going to work every morning. And it's like and the irony of this is just
palpable. That it has to be said that were Trump the Trump-Carson vision to realize exactly what you were talking about, it would be a radically different direction from where HUD is going now.
True.
Right.
That under the last 8 years, frankly, my frustrations, my disappointments, let's say, with the Obama administration have been crystallized in HUD, in a department that $400 million reserve in CHA. Let's look at that for 1 second. Why is it there? The CHA portfolio has changed dramatically over the last 15 years in that public housing has been, the hard units of public housing have been demolished, the high rises have been demolished, the number of residents has grown. There are now 100,000 low-income families in the city who have housing choice vouchers. That money is helping the vouchers are helping. For people who don't know how they work, you go into a private apartment with a voucher, you pay a percentage of your income in rent, the balance of what the market rate rent is paid by the government. So those government dollars are going into private landlords' hands, generally into large institutional landlords like the Habitat Corporation, I think is the largest beneficiary, let's say, of of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So that $400 million is really sitting there for development, right? That's what it's for. But they've had this idea that we need to do mixed income development.
Right.
Well, this is a concept that nobody wants.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to live there, and nobody wants to even build it.
You know, this really is the nut of this show today. This is the thing that I really was hungering to talk to you guys about. You were in the Daley administration when it seems to me, when you look back on it with some history, it really appears to be one of those kind of like theories that just sort of dropped on the table all of a sudden. And I'm not blaming any one administration for this, but suddenly everybody drank that Kool-Aid. Oh, the reason public housing has failed is because there aren't enough wealthy people living in public housing. We gotta stir it all up and do 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? A
So
third.
the residents will get, middle class values
That's
by
right,
osmosis.
right. It'll
That's right,
help.
that's
It'll
right.
help
Yeah.
those poor people if
Yeah.
they're around richer people.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
And for a while there, it kind of sounded like, well, hey, nothing else is working. Let's give this a shot. And I think the Daley administration went for it, as did many others.
Yes, certainly.
And now we're looking back on it, and I think most people now are just kind of scratching their heads and saying, what were we thinking?
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was this sense, and Daley even talk about it, how it was transforming people's souls. So it went more than just,
say that.
what you think public housing would do. It would somehow get inside your bones and
Right,
make things different for you.
right.
And it doesn't. But the thing is that people never want to realize is that what poor people need are jobs and education. Same thing. It's as simple as that. If you have a job, you have a decent education, you tend not to live in public housing.
Given the choice between living next to a rich guy or having a decent job, I think I'd take the decent job.
I'll take the job.
Thank you very
Exactly.
much. Yeah.
Exactly. And also that the people who live in public housing, they know how to negotiate and live in their environments. I mean, it isn't. Listen. Before I covered architecture, I spent years covering crime for the Sun-Times and then the City News Bureau. And and I grew up on the South Side, although not in public housing. And, there's this sort of sense of what public housing is. And there were all kinds of bad documentaries in the 90s and the 80s. I found them on YouTube, and it's just astounding how bleak and dismal these things were. And then, you go to public housing and you go and you meet people. And you think that could be my aunt, that could be my cousin, that is my cousin, and that perhaps, that kind of thing. Yeah. And that all they needed was the boot off their neck. They didn't need anything else. Right. I say they like there's, but it's like, but constantly what happens is these kind of things are superimposed on them. We'll build towers for them. We'll put them next to rich people. We'll do this. All they need is opportunities. Like we all need.
We'll put a swing set down in the plaza.
We'll put a pool. We'll make them wet. That kind of thing. All these kind of things happen over the years. When all is needed is the same thing every American needs is opportunity.
And there was also, I think, something else about public housing, that it was regarded by white America as as Black America.
Yeah.
Public housing was where Black people lived. The truth was that it was always the very edge of the African American community. It was actually the place where white and Black America met and transacted, often in illegal ways. I mean, that was what public housing was set up to do, to be this kind of transitional, transactional zone. And I remember covering crime for the Defender years ago, when I first started coming into public housing, and I had the idea that the drug trade was going to be furtive and was going to be, people dashing up and buying some drugs from a hole in the wall and then running away quickly, No, this was open. There were lines up and down the block. There were people, directing traffic.
Sure.
There were, and then people who were buying drugs in the development. This is important because people today don't have a physical experience of the development. So some have romantic views of what the developments were, and there was always a strong sense of community there. There was always a strong family spirit. There was always there were always people who were, frankly, just like everybody else in America, who were living there. At the same time, there was crime and violence that were located there because the powers that be were comfortable with them being located there and not being located in other places as a result. you have to look at Stateway Gardens, which was, you know, a block and a half from the new police headquarters, and the only time that there was ever kind of any concerted effort to break up the drug dealing in Stateway Gardens was when an errant bullet from the development hit a car in the parking lot of the employees at the police headquarters. So you have a deliberate location of these types of things in the developments. The idea being that when the developments were demolished, a lot of people thought the problem will go away. That was the idea, that we will demolish the problem when we demolish these buildings, because the buildings are
the problem.
Are somehow doing it to the people.
Yeah. You know, it's again, from the perspective of today, looking back over the last 20, 30 years, it's so interesting to look at the crime numbers that we're all suffering with right now. And it always strikes me that sometimes we get this kind of throwaway line in a story about, yes, these are the highest numbers since the 90s. And then you think, well, you know, I lived here in the 90s, and I don't remember, I'm a white person, I live in the white community, I don't believe that I was as freaked out about crime in the 90s as I am today, about street shooting type crime. And yet it was much worse statistically. And that is exactly the reason. It's because it was confined to a few places, and I think there was a kind of a general sense of, well, as long as it's confined there and it's not in all these other places in the city, that's probably the best we can do.
And in news, you know, we were there. I mean, news reporters, particularly television news, which really amplifies this stuff, didn't cover those kind of the crimes as much. And I can remember working at the City News Bureau in the '90s, in the late '80s, and you know, you cover every shooting, but you know, only a handful ever bubbled up to be something that got reported on widely. You know, and I remember reporting on all kinds of atrocities that would happen on the West Side, South Side, middle of the night, and you know, only a small percentage of those actually got to the point where it was reported on widely.
It was a different city in those days. The African American community, I mean, we were talking about fair housing, you know, a few minutes ago. Look, Chicago is a place where fair housing laws have never been enforced. The African American community is segregated in Chicago. The borders of that segregation have changed. And the African American community today is 20% smaller than it was in the 90s, and I would say 20% more contained geographically in parts of the South and West Sides. When I was covering
Thanks to housing vouchers. In part, right?
They've done a lot. I mean, the demolition of public housing, frankly, it was just a demolition of a resource for low-income people. That's all that it was. It was a kind of a resource, a second-rate, Soviet-style, crappy resource, but it was a resource. And taking it away just took that away. That means that they have a little bit less. They also have a little bit less geographically. I think there's a coincidental relationship there, right? That the territory was taken away at the same time as the resource was removed. And so what you're seeing today, I think, is very similar in that you have this community. I mean, I remember taking a bus one day when I was covering the homicide beat at the police beat at it really was the homicide beat, but it was officially the police beat at the Defender. And I remember one day getting a report early in the morning and realizing that I could just take the bus from homicide to homicide from my home in Wicker Park down to police headquarters at 11th and State. I got on the bus at around Western and Milwaukee, stopped at 2 homicides on Milwaukee before I got downtown, and then another one in the South Loop, and one more nearby. So that whole part of the city, from Wicker Park down to the South Loop, doesn't look anything like it did back then. And when you see, in other words, the 700 homicide rate in the city for this year so far, it's in a smaller area with a smaller population. That's really where it's concentrated. And I'll say something else. It's also doesn't take into account that the technology, the medical technology, has improved tremendously.
That's huge. That's huge.
So true. We've talked about that a number of times on the program here today. you know, I think the city is in a really weird position on this because, as you know, I worked for mayor at the same time you did, and one of my jobs was running around the city doing videos talking about all the great things going on in the city. And I'm sure that whoever's doing it now would love to do some stories about the absolutely phenomenal increases in efficiencies at the fire department. The fire department has turned into a MASH unit of the highest caliber.
It really has.
They're doing phenomenal work.
It's an untold story, largely,
Yeah,
but it's true.
but you can't tell that story because if you told that story, you would have to reveal that, well, the 700 murders would be more like 1,200 because that's how many they're saving every day out on the streets.
Right. So
No, you're right. I mean, you know, they're higher velocity weapons now that people are shooting today that do more damage. That if we were doing this with yesterday's technology, yeah, you would. You're right. We'd see 900,000, 1,100 murders easily, I think.
and I think that when you think about what that means within the African American community, that makes me wonder if things aren't worse than they were in the 90s, even much worse.
Well, and you see it. You see it with the out-migration. I mean, the thing that, and the urban planning circles that I hang and run in, I mean, the thing that's finally being talked about is the 200,000 people who left the city this century, and almost all of them being black. And, they're fed up with schools, violence, they live in Rosen, and the job is in Schaumburg, and it's like, all this stuff together. So I think things are worse. I think that people are voting with their feet, just like we did 70 years ago, which is how all of us got to Chicago from Mississippi and Alabama. It's like, this is for the birds, I'm leaving. I think we're seeing, we are seeing an outward migration, which gets us back to HUD and our guy Ben Carson, that it is all the more important.
Do you think he understands any of this?
No, I think he does not. I think he sees it as a choice. People are choosing to do this. And in any governmental intervention, this is my fear, that he thinks that any governmental intervention is Soviet, is communist, and is social engineering and is wrong. At precisely the time we need cities to be equitable places for black and brown people, and for poor white people as well. And they tend to get left out of the equation because they don't want to claim poverty often. But it has to be equitable places for them as well.
The United States is very rare in the developed world for being a country in which the urban core is not the most desirable place to live. Right? If you go to 43rd in Indiana, that should be thriving based on its geographic proximity to the money centers of the Midwest, right? But it's empty. 43rd in Indiana is vacant on all four corners today, and that makes no sense unless you understand that all housing and all real estate in this country is subsidized. We subsidize it in various ways with housing, with mortgage interest deductions on our taxes, with highways that make places like Schaumburg, frankly, accessible to the money centers of the country. So HUD plays an essential role in that. I've said for a long time that the CHA is the biggest real estate player in the city, and yet they're acting like they're begging for favors from people. They pay premiums to developers. They, when they've for now generations made people into millionaires, right? Yeah. This is a system that Ben Carson is inheriting, and I just don't feel that he has any appreciation for how to make that work.
There's a different aspect to this that has really been on my mind lately, which is the non-CHA sort of quasi-private business of trying to develop low and middle income housing. I don't think we're doing all that well with it, but there's the whole the recent redevelopment Marshall Field Gardens, and Michigan Boulevard Gardens, the same thing. So these are the agencies that did this are not public agencies. They're kind of not-for-profits, aren't they? I think, if I'm not mistaken. Is there any future there? And is it possible that a guy like I just forgot his name, Ben Carson. That a guy like Ben Carson could look at that model and say, maybe that's what we want to do. Maybe we want to do more of that kind of thing.
You know, I think he would, up until the point he turns to page 2 of this proposal, and he realizes that a lot of that funding comes from it's tax credits, it's public funding of a different source.
Right.
And I think that's when he closes the book up and
Yeah,
says,
those people just have to work hard.
Exactly. They have to stop wishing to be poor and do something about it. Yeah, but this is a good question. I mean, public housing starts off in this country as being run by private entities. You know, it was Julius Rosenwald who started the Michigan Avenue Boulevard Apartments and was only satisfied with 3% return on it. Finds out his heirs find out later on that we're going to be upside down in this thing pretty soon. That the money we take in doesn't really pay for the cost of keeping up. And then the government sort of steps in and right around the same time and makes Lathrop Homes and others around the city. So this has always been a tricky thing. But I think that the problem is, the issue is that we've never just said consistently flat as a nation or as a city that quality housing is a right. Just like air and water and voting and all that kind of stuff, and that if we want to be a viable country, we want to be a viable city, we can't have people living in shacks. We do a little bit, and then we fall off again, right?
Yeah.
But just say it and put it in brick and mortar and in your heart, and just say, look, we're just not going to have this. We're the richest country in the world. We're not going to have this.
It's the same argument we've been having for years about health, right?
Yeah.
Health care should be a right.
Certainly
And there should be a certain level of health care that everyone gets. Everybody gets to this level on the platform. And we get this far with it, and then then there's a revolution, and the right takes over again and says, no, that's communism. We can't have that.
The right and centrist Democrats who don't. I mean, the
Yeah.
Democratic Party, got issues. This is not the party of Roosevelt or even of. It's left. It's farther to the right than Eisenhower was as a Republican in the 50s.
Right.
And I think that they have to. Obviously step up and fight for these things that they didn't want to fight for.
You look at North Carolina, which is the one bright spot in the Democratic map in the country. And what do you have there? You have the Reverend William Barber, right, leading the Moral Monday crowd.
Yeah.
That is what won that state. Hillary Clinton lost North Carolina, but North Carolina's governor changed because the Moral Monday crowd had been on this for 3 years. What is the essence of their message? It's constitutionality and it's religious morality. These are essentially kind of conservative values, but they have been successfully channeled by a multiracial, grassroots, egalitarian movement in the Deep South, or in North Carolina's.
Well, Mid-South.
Mid-South, yeah. Mid-South, right? In the South, for sure. And that's something that I think, to Lee's point about where the Democratic Party is, when you acquiesce to letting some people have the right to things and others not, right? The middle class has a right to health care and housing, right? The mortgage interest deduction really helps a lot of people stay in places that they couldn't afford otherwise. Not to mention the 30-year mortgage in the first place, which other countries just don't even have. There's no such thing as a 30-year mortgage. What's a 30-year mortgage, right? That's frankly, on an actuarial analysis, is probably a ridiculous concept, right? I mean, very few people even get to close to the end of that 30-year mortgage. So these are ways that if you've got your control panel of a society, that we're all adjusting.
And if you have a job, you have health insurance, at least until recently.
Yeah, and
that's all part of the contract.
Yeah, and I can say, as someone who's an independent, as a writer, I'm an independent contractor. I've used Obamacare for the last couple of years, and what I've discovered is that low-income people have Medicaid. People at the most employed people have health care through their jobs. The people who are using Obamacare are middle-income professionals. When you see kind of the reluctance on the Republican Party to to get rid of Obamacare without a replacement, when you see people kind of hemming and hawing about how they're going to actually do it, that's what they're responding to. They know that there are a lot of people who are resourceful and
maybe people on their own staff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the reality with where these kinds of rights, the debate on rights really is we're really talking about negotiating, I think as you said very well, what it means to live in a developed country.
Right. I mean, I guess I've been almost all the way up to the wall. I mean, just as far as you can go in thinking this thing through lately, and coming to the conclusion that the agenda of the American left has essentially died.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist anymore. This notion, this, I would call it egalitarian notion, that there should be some level of equality for all people, and that wealth should not be, I mean, it doesn't have to, I'm not talking about everybody gets an equal share, but that people who are incredibly rich have a responsibility to share some of their resources with people who, for what various reasons, can't get there. I think that notion has just gone away.
I think you're right, and I think that as it goes away, there's a cruel flip to it too, which is that things that belong to the public, schools, housing, those kind of things, somehow wind up in the hands of rich people.
Yeah.
And you know, my fear lately is that libraries and water will become
Oh, yeah.
water. That water that
Yeah.
you know, some giant infrastructure.
How dare you drink all that water for free?
That's right. Drink out the lake. You know that some giant infrastructure guy is going to wave $3 billion at this municipality or someone and take water, and water becomes like
and
a
the
utility.
EPA won't be there to stop it.
Exactly.
That's, to me, why this conversation is so pertinent. You know, we talk about public housing as if it's this peripheral issue. The truth is, this was a public resource. This
Exactly.
was a public resource that control and the assets were transferred to wealthy people. People made money off of the demolition.
Yes.
They are making money off the mixed income communities not getting built. The not building of things is making people a lot of money. You know, even things well-intentioned, things like the Gautreaux Decree, right? With this effort, this civil rights lawsuit, which just turned 50 years old. 50 years old for a Supreme Court decision to desegregate housing. If you look at what actually happened with the Gautreaux Decree did not, obviously, affect the desegregation of housing, public or otherwise, in Chicago and in surrounding areas. What it did accomplish was steer a lot of public resources into the hands of private folks. Public housing is the harbinger of what is going to happen to the rest of this society. They're shaking us by our ankles and taking the change that falls out of our pockets. That's
God
essentially
help
what
the
happened.
schools. That's, I mean,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that to me is the part that I'm just finding most repulsive. I don't know how to describe the anger that I'm feeling, but we've seen this coming. I would say that the privatization of the prison system was kind of like the harbinger for the privatization of schools, because after all, what's the difference, right? You're just housing a bunch of people against their will all day long and feeding them some bad food, and you know, that's it, right?
My third grader would agree with you.
Yeah, there's really very little difference. It's another form of incarceration. And so why can't the private sector do that, right? I mean, why do you have to have all these public school teachers to do it? But it just feels to me like something really elemental, something really fundamental about the founding of our nation is going away here, because that was the idealistic view, wasn't it? That every American should have equal access to at least a level of free public education.
No, that was never the concept for this country.
Not for all of us, at least.
The country was, I mean, truthfully.
Well,
and the same people who are suffering on the backside of that broken contract, the same people who always suffered.
Right.
You know.
Because that's the debate. You know, in Europe, they're very kind, you know, with their public welfare benefits, not because they care about the poor, they care about poor Germans. They care about poor Frenchmen. It's our fellow countrymen who are who are suffering. We must help them.
So
you
the
know?
United States has always had a kind of a unique problem there.
Yeah. If you go to South America, class identity in a lot of these countries is a lot more powerful than national identity. Being a rich Argentine is probably a lot more important to someone. They wouldn't, you know, on soccer days they might think differently, but on most days being a wealthy Argentine is much more important than being a poor Argentine. And being a wealthy Argentine, you frankly have a lot more in common than a wealthy person with a wealthy person in New York or Paris or Hong Kong than you do with someone half a mile from you in their version of the favelas. Yeah. So this is the new reality, and we have to also admit, nation states, these are fictions that we all decide to participate in. We've all decided to make this a country. We all decide, here's this line on the map, this is a border. On this side is this country, on this side is the other. That border has been negotiated. Where that border is has never really been the same, and it's moved constantly. Likewise, the border inside the country over who's in and who's out, who's deserving and who's not, who has rights and who doesn't. This has always been an internal debate in this country, and we've never been reconciled to that being to everybody within that fiction of a nation state having the same rights and expectations. That's never been, respectfully, that's never been a part of what this country is.
That's a very good point. and it's interesting that I actually hold both beliefs at the same time. That yes, obviously the evidence is abundant that we've never lived up to that belief, or whatever you want to call it. But at least we've gone so far as to have mouthed the words that we believe that people should be entitled to these things.
Occasionally.
And then we've fought for the last 200 years over who should be included in that group, I suppose.
But I agree, and I think that the idea that the country can, if forced, live up to those ideals has been the sustaining thing for many groups of people, right?
Thank you for putting it in better words than I did. Yes,
migrants coming from the South. That even if we're being maltreated, I think I can force them to do correctly, and I think that's always been a sustaining thing. I think that. I wonder. I really do wonder about how sustaining that is going forward. I mean, there seems to be and I think that Ben Carson's quote about poverty being choice, it just sort of is emblematic of this kind of thought that I've seen coming up, at least in the years since Reagan, which is that somehow if you're not doing well in this land of opportunity, that it's your fault. And you didn't do something, you're not doing something, and it's so pervasive and it's so everywhere that even, poor white people who live in Walmartville, south of I-80 and below Mason-Dixon line, who in some respects are just as under the gun as many minority groups, you see how they vote on election day. They vote for people who are going to take away the very nets and social nets that they need to sustain themselves.
I remember when I ran the Residence Journal, the magazine for and by public housing tenants, Mary Piemonte now was my deputy there. On one election day, mayoral election day, she was going up and down the State Street corridor, Stateway Gardens, Robert Taylor Homes, interviewing people about who they were voting for. And most of the people were voting for Daley. And this was after Mayor Daley had come out with this plan to, the plan for transformation to demolish public housing. And so it was a question, that she was asking, like, well, just very pragmatically, you're voting for the guy that's demolishing your home. Like, is that not in any way kind of a conflict for you? And for most people, it wasn't. And Mary, kept her reportorial cool for most of the day. But then at one point, she just lost it with someone who was a particularly enthusiastic, Daley fan. And she said, "But why? Why are you voting for the guy? He's tearing down your home." And the man shrugged his shoulders and said, "I think he's a good mayor. I think he's doing the right thing." So, people have an ability to, for both good and bad, I think, to see a self-interest in a broader society. Do you know what I mean? It's
but what you're talking about there is political skill. I mean, and I think that's
These people are making a rational decision. They're not
well, they were
fools.
making a rational decision to support a guy who I think we now know with some perspective of distance had remarkable political skills, especially when, and you would know this better than anyone, when Richard M. Daley appeared in the black community, especially at church gatherings and that kind of thing. He was incredibly persuasive. He was incredibly powerful.
And he also benefited from having weak opposition for almost all of his 22 years. I mean, you know, he fought Tim Evans to get the spot, and no mayoral candidate has come. The vote total came even closer.
And we haven't.
It was embarrassing at some point. The guys who were running against him, you know, halfway through his history.
He had substantial African American support, which he cultivated throughout his entire 22 years. He, as I recall, always kept an eye on whether he had the majority of the African American vote. That was important to him, to get the majority and then to hold the majority. And you know, and he was accessible to the African American community. Tim Evans has did quite well under the Daley. During the Daley years, you know, he's now the chief judge of the courts. So Daley knew how to open the tent and how to destroy opponents. Certainly, he was not. I wouldn't describe him as a generous opponent, but
I guess the point that I was trying to get at, and we can get off of this, but the point that I was trying to get at is that I was never particularly surprised that a number of people who live in public housing would be at least conceptually supportive of the mayor saying, this is bad, this public housing is very bad, I'm going to tear it down. And without going to, as you say, Lee, page 2 of the plan, it's like, yeah, you know, that probably makes sense. You know, I think it's probably.
Well, that's right.
And he says he's going to give me a rehab department when it's over in just a couple of years.
That's I think, exactly the point. That you had half the city saying, let's tear down these buildings, they're incarcerating these poor people. You had the other half of the city saying, these buildings are palaces for welfare queens. That's a consensus.
Yeah, it is kind of a bizarre consensus.
It is. And then he did promise, you know, there'd be better connection to services, better connection to jobs. I mean, there were things that were promised on that first page.
We're going to build such nice places. There'll be a Starbucks on the corner, and you'll be able to go there and get a coffee on your way to work every day.
That's right. And better connection to job resources. I mean, there were things promised on page 1 that didn't perhaps make their way to page 5 with the same vigor.
You know, I'm feeling very jealous of our time. I want to talk to you about a couple of just really down-to-earth, here and now things right now. Lathrop Homes and Natalie Moore did an excellent piece yesterday on WBEZ about Ickey's Homes, which I had fallen out of my consciousness. I didn't even remember that Ickey's Homes had been completely taken down. And here it is in this just beautiful sweet spot between Jones Commercial High School and, you know, and the development on the near South Side. So of course they're not going to rebuild, what was it, 750 or whatever it was, I forgot the number, 800. There were 800 units demolished there. Now they're talking about maybe replacing them with 244. Of course, the number is irrelevant because the number right now is 0. Nothing is there. So let's talk about that a little bit. But also the whole thing about Lathrop Homes, which is it's a completely different conversation about a public housing development that was one of the first, it may have been the first, and was in so many ways really successful. I mean, I wouldn't you? Okay, you're the public housing expert, but wouldn't you say that? I mean, it was somewhat diverse. It existed in a very different kind of world, and now we're talking about the same thing, about making it into like 200 units instead of whatever it is. There's 925 down to 400 with a whole bunch of other market rate stuff in there. Why do we need market rate there? It's so much a big topic, but I just wanted to throw it out here because I really want to get your perspective on this.
Well, Lathrop Homes is, as you said, it's on the north side. It's like spreads out from Damon and Diversey, roughly along the riverfront there. 700 units. It was diverse in the sense that it had historically an African American, a Latino, and a white population all living together. And
But also diverse economically to some degree, right? I mean, come on, it's a public housing development.
yeah, I didn't see that, and
Yeah,
I saw
okay,
that it had
all
basically the same issues as every other public housing development, which at the time that Lathrop was fully populated, frankly, didn't stand out from the rest of the neighborhood. The neighborhood, that
true.
whole area was like that.
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
What changed was the rest of the neighborhood. Lathrop then started to stand out and become an obvious target, I would say, for those that don't like public housing. The problem with Lathrop was that it had an organized resident leadership who knew what was coming and worked hard to mitigate the problems as much as they could, and have fought back, to a degree as well as the folks at Cabrini Green, who've also kind of worked hard to negotiate some sort of at least compensation, if not actual ability to return for their residents. That's really what a lot of what's going on behind the scenes, is that the Housing Authority will shut down newcomers, will stop admitting people to these developments, which is what happened, I guess, in the early noughts, in the early 2000s in Lathrop. They just stopped taking people, new residents. Well, every year somebody leaves, somebody dies, somebody gets married and moves away, and the CHA will offer you a housing choice voucher to move out for the most part, and they're working hard on evictions and other sides. So there's a way of depopulating the development and then getting it to a point where it is now, where you have less than 100 units that are occupied, and that is the kind of resistance that's frankly pretty easy to overcome.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure what my question is here, but I mean, it just seems to me like something is being lost at Lathrop. I get a feeling of something, of an opportunity anyway, being blown.
If we get back to this sort of social pact that we're kind of hinting at and talking about through all this, I mean, here's an opportunity to build housing in an area of the city where they'd be close to jobs, have the riverfront as an amenity to you. At the exact time that the city and other agencies like the Metropolitan Planning Council are thinking about remaking the river, where it could be, again, a fair and equitable place for people to live, and that's being taken away and placed further and further into private hands. It's like, years ago, watching a program on this very network, this very station, Phil Jackson, who heads the Black Star Project, said something on this show. I was up in the middle of the night. I think my youngest was still a baby, which is why I was still up. This must have been 2001, and he said, any place in the world where there are black people in land, their position on that land is contested. Now, in Lathrop, we can add Latinos and whites too as well. But it's true, and particularly if the land has any whit of value, any bit of positive location, close to something good, then it's contested. So the people who need these amenities the most, because they can't get them any other way, are the ones that are being run off. I mean, that's the thing I think that might be underlying in some parts of your question.
And look,
yes, I think so.
We look at these developments. We look at subsidies for middle income people as providing them with benefits they deserve, and we look at providing services to low income people as charity. And the result is that when we don't feel particularly charitable as a society, we pull back, and that's frankly an error, I think, in the way that we calculate how we're running our society. Because if you look at a place like Lathrop, there is the opportunity that Lee just talked about to take a development and have a mixed income, an actual mixed income neighborhood.
Make it dramatically better.
You could apply. You could bring anybody you wanted into that development because the housing in that area is actually sought after. So you could have Mayor Emanuel could have come out there, and it's, by the way, walking distance from his home. in Ravenswood. Long walk, but it's walking distance. I mean,
He's fit. He can handle it.
you know, he could have come out there and say, like, look, this is housing for veterans. This is housing for families that have been foreclosed on. This is housing, you know, that he didn't do that in an overwhelmingly democratic city tells you that the race component of what Lee was talking about is what we're dealing with here. Lathrop is maybe a diverse development in reality, but for everybody else, you say public housing, they think black people, they think African Americans. And that's really what we're dealing with Ben Carson at HUD also. It's like, why pick Ben Carson for HUD? What is his qualification for HUD?
He's urban.
He's urban,
Yeah.
that's right. And J.C. Watts for agriculture. So, so that, I shouldn't joke about that. But he is looking at J.C. Watts for agriculture. It does make you think,
Yeah. Well, I think maybe this is as good a time as any to just kind of grind this thing to a halt because I'm depressed. I really am. I'm sorry. It's a very interesting time to be alive in America. I find myself really just anxious for it to be about 2 or 3 years from now to look back at this moment and see what happened, because I don't have a sense of it. I really don't.
Well, we got to figure out a way to end this without having wanting to hang ourselves in depression. So
let's do that. That's your job, Lee. You're the optimist.
Let's try this. All right. So we don't to put some sunshine on this thing somehow. If Donald Trump at his core is a deal maker, right? I mean, that's
Right.
not building stuff doesn't make him rich. Although he could probably, if he could find a way to do it, he probably would. That at some point, hopefully, those instincts will kick in, and that that it isn't about cutting and denying that at some point, particularly when it comes to cities. I don't know. I give up right in the middle of my own thing. I was going so well. I was going to give, but no, I can't believe I'm saying no. I think I can't believe
This is so cool because you just did what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks. I'll be sitting watching this stuff on TV, and this thought will begin to blossom in my head that, like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if 8 years from now, when he's just leaving office, we're all saying, can't believe what an unbelievably creative president he was. He just basically tore up the book and started over, and some things didn't go as well as it, but basically things went really well with the Trump administration.
I'll put something. This is not exactly a happy note, but let me just say this: that I started writing The Defender with an assumption that progress is a reality.
Yeah.
Okay, that society makes a little bit of progress incrementally. But when I got to the end of the book, I don't want
to hear this.
well, no, think about it for a second. I got to the end of the book, I realized, I said, there really isn't progress. If I look at it, the only progress that we've made is just enough to accommodate the growing, more complicated population. We don't make any more effort. So if that can be sad to say, oh, there's no progress. But if you kind of get past that for a minute and say to yourself, oh, there's no progress, so what is really our responsibility here? Our responsibility, I would say, is to take care of those in front of us, to make the best of the situation for them, to try to mitigate the horrors that are visited on people, on whom the horrors are usually visited, and to try to understand that we're that kind of species that's progressing through history without making progress necessarily on other, in our evolution. That's not how we're moving. And I think if you kind of liberate yourself from that, then you just are adjusting to a certain kind of reality without disappointment.
We're just basically another organism clinging to this rock, hurtling through space, right? And we're evolving a little bit, but not much. Elephants aren't much different today than they were 1,000 years ago, and neither are we.
That's right.
Thanks.
That's right. I still want to hang myself. Let me try. I'll say this, though. I think it becomes incumbent on big city mayors, which are often becoming little islands of of blue and oceans of red.
The reader picture of the red ocean with this little tiny island with a city Chicago
Exactly.
flag
I
on
mean,
it.
it's happening here. I mean, it's amazing how it happened in Illinois. You know, Illinois was a centrist kind of state, and but now it's not. But Chicago still is. And I think the idea of sanctuary cities, which we apply to the undocumented, I think it's going to have to apply to all of us. That mayors of big cities, the Chicago's, the Detroit's, others around, is that these will have to become cities with sanctuary for lots of other
so
reasons
we will
and
all
things.
be sanctuary clients.
But in the end, it could make cities better. Cities have always held out this carrot of being these places where there's employment and equity and fairness, and it snatches the carrot back if the people who reach for it are too black and too brown. Now it can't afford to do that anymore. If the south and west sides of Chicago losing population, losing all kinds of things, 200,000 white people aren't going to come and take over the south side of Chicago in the next 30 years, but it could become an integrated community where the population growth decrease of black people are slowed by the fact that the cities become is beginning to take care of it.
It could be 200,000 Latinos coming in to mix.
I would hope so,
Yeah.
but even for that to happen, because the Latino population are out migrating
to the
more
suburbs.
to the suburbs and skipping the city entirely.
Right.
But I think you're right though that it can indeed be a place where blacks, Latinos, and others could live together.
Yeah.
And I think that mayors are going to have to be visionary enough to push this, which means that cities are going to move further to the left, probably become more progressive.
Well,
That's interesting.
one of the things that has definitely occurred to me as a part of this whole conversation about the Electoral College is that the sort of intellectual side of my brain is saying, well, it does make sense. I mean, you can understand why you want to have this kind of firewall so that no one population center has sway over another. The other side of it is saying, oh, screw that. You know what? America is an agglomeration of great cities and a whole bunch of sort of basically wasteland out there outside the cities. And it's time for the cities to stand up and say, this is where all the people live, this is where all the money is made, this is where all the need is, and we intend to take back the government and have the government be favorable to us.
But it has to do that within its own borders first. In order for Chicago or New York or LA or any place to claim the moral superiority to do that, to say that nationally, it has to take it. It can't do that and have Roseland and Riverdale and Austin looking the way it does. It has to tend to these places first.
Yeah, but I guess I would chicken and egg that and say the first thing you have to say is these population centers are morally superior to Montana. They just really are. And we are going to claim the government, and we are going to take what's rightly ours, and we're going to get the resources that will allow us to do the things you're saying.
But they're not. That's
Sure they are.
No, they're definitely not. We can't look at Englewood and see justice. That's not where we are as a society or as a nation. I was as horrified as most people in the cities were by like the takeovers of the Bundy takeovers of their ranches and places like that. But these are people that are talking about not getting a share of the resources. That's what they're complaining about. That's, the people that voted for Trump in this election, these weren't low-income people. Low-income people voted for the Democrats.
That's a point that I wanted to make earlier.
Yeah.
That this is not a case of to be very disparaging about it. The Walmart crowd voting for Trump. No, they were educated and
these are
high-income
educated people who have a stake in this society. They have, I think they made a bad choice, personally, but it's their right to make that choice, and I respect them as adults making it. Just like I look at Englewood and I say, we've made this decision collectively. You know what I mean? We have to own this. This is our responsibility, and we have to collectively figure out a way to not. This is not, this is not hard. This is not like something that can't be fixed. This is something we don't want to fix.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here wondering if anybody is going to watch or listen to an hour and 4 minutes of this. But
We are.
I know I would. I thought this was a wonderful conversation, and I just really thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And I hope that you enjoyed this too, and that you'll come back again, because next week we're going to talk about the mess in Springfield. So it's just hopeless. I mean, it's just. Welcome to Depressing Chicago Newsroom, the program that'll make you want to kill yourself. And anyway, okay.
And happy holidays.
Thank you. Yes, Merry Christmas to you, since the war on Christmas is over now.
That's right.
Lee Bay, Man About Town, Rock on Tour, and just general guy who you go to when you really want to hear some very smart talk. I appreciate you very much being here. Ethan Michaeli, author of The Defender, a book that if you haven't read it yet, you need to. But you do have to, set aside a few days because it's a big book, big long book, and a great read. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You, are you still here? Are you still watching? Wow, congratulations. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom, the longest show in the history of the entire run of the program. And I thank you very much for being here with us. And as I said, I've been saying a little bit, we're going to have some big news in the next few weeks about how we're going to be expanding the show a little bit and making it a little bit easier for you to watch without having to run off to YouTube, as you have done for this one. So we appreciate that too. Thanks. See you next week. Bye-bye.